Third edition D&D brought the monk class back as a base class. There was a monk class in first edition D&D, and in third edition, I guess they decided, hey, you know what's cool? Martial artists, and everybody was like, yeah, that's pretty cool. Let's make them in D&D. And then they're like, oh, sure, why not? So since Trocare grew up with third edition D&D, I needed a monastery where people could go and learn how to fight with their bare hands and feet or spears while not wearing shirts and jumping through the air at onkegs. And my thought at first was just a temple in the middle of a plain. There's just, this vast grassland expanse. And then there's, a stone wall and then like a pagoda inside of it. And then like a training yard with statues. Be kind of cool. And for the long, I had given it a name at the beginning, and it did nothing but exist as a name to reference. So it's just, the PCs, if one of them was a monk, they would still be adventuring in the ruins of Trocare, but the monk could always say he trained at Xian Gi Wo, which was the name I gave to the monastery, which for the longest time I had forgotten. I knew it started with an X, but I couldn't remember the name. And when I found the Hoach the other day, I also found a document listing the name, and so I'm so happy I found that so I can remember what it was again. So what about Xian Gi Wo? There were actually three monasteries in Trocare at the beginning. Xian Gi Wo was the base monastery. Everybody who was a monk trained there. And then there were a couple monk prestige classes that I allowed. Two of them had their own monasteries elsewhere. They were very small and very specialized. Everything else that a monk would want to do was at Xian Gi Wo. But once again, it was just a name. I say you trained at Xian Gi Wo, and that's it. End of story. Nobody actually went there. The headmaster never had a name, and nothing like that. Well, now, since we're populating a sandbox world, there needs to be a Xian Gi Wo to go explore. And since the original conception, there was a change in Xian Gi Wo. When I took my first year of college at Mesa Community College, they had the Red Mountain campus. It had just opened. And on the second floor balcony, you could stand on the eastern side and look sort of a little bit northeast from the school, and there was mountains. Anywhere you stand in Mesa, Arizona, you can see mountains in all four directions. But the mountains in the distance, there was a tower on it, and that I think it was a radio tower of some sort. But when I was out there before my psychology class, which was at 6:30 in the morning, you would catch the sunrise over those mountains, and that radio tower was there, and it just looked cool. And so I'm like, okay, now Xian Gi Wo is a pagoda up on a mountain somewhere. And so that's the starting point for the Trocare Xian Gi Wo. I'm actually going to keep both of the Xian Gi Wo ideas, the temple in the plains and the temple up on the mountain. And it could actually be the same monastery, or it could be two separate but linked monasteries. The one in the plains is going to be the lower level, closer to find encounter area, and then the one up in the mountains is going to be higher level. Not too much higher. It doesn't have to be massively higher level, although you could have yet a third Xian Gi Wo, like at the top of one of the tallest mountains, where that could be a really high level area. But I really have a good idea for a manticore in the mountain area. I really want it to be a manticore because I think the only time I've ever killed a player was with a manticore. The guy jumped up on the roof to fight the manticore. The manticore stabbed him with all of his tail spikes and then pushed him off the building, and he died when he hit the ground. It was awesome. It was super awesome. But I want a manticore to be there. And what we're dealing with here, since Xian Gi Wo has never been detailed at all with anything, everything we make up here is finally new content. Now, the most obvious thing to populate Xian Gi Wo are undead. You had all these monks and masters training there, and then the bad thing happened such that the world is now dangerous and unpopulated by civilized races. And so when you head to this temple, you have these undead masters of the martial arts, which is a cool idea in and of itself. Especially because one of the high level abilities of the monk is that they stopped aging. They still died when they hit old age, which was lame, but they stopped actually physically aging. The undead is too easy. There are so many different places in the campaign world that you can stick undead as an enemy. To stick them everywhere would be too predictable, too boring. So we had to think of something else for Xian Gi Wo. My second thought was traps. Why would there be traps in Xian Gi Wo? Why would they trap the monastery? Well, doesn't it just make sense? You have a bunch of martial artists in this monastery, so obviously they're going to have a danger room. And I'm imagining a building, and this is still up in the mountains, the higher level one. I'm imagining a set of buildings or a section of their monastery that is just trapped with actually lethal. Wow, you got to see Kevin sign on. Hi, Kevin. Lethal traps. And so when they're traveling through that part of the monastery, you have to deal with traps. That's cool. Um, Not quite enough yet, though. So another idea I had was to use hobgoblins. Hobgoblins are a militaristic goblin race. In third edition, they really hit home on the whole. These guys are organized and intelligent, and they're not the mindless, barbaric little goblins that you deal with all the time. So maybe there's a troop of hobgoblins that have infested the monastery. Now, I didn't like the idea up in the mountains, so I think there's going to be hobgoblins in the monastery on the plains. They've taken up residence there, and so they're an enemy that lives in that monastery and trains in that monastery. Of course, not necessarily training in the martial arts like monks, but just that's their little home base out on the plains. A good idea that I had, I say a good idea, I'm biased towards that. The monastery up in the plains can obviously have a map or some other clue to the monastery up in the mountains. And what I wanted in the monastery in the mountains was a library. That monastery probably has scrolls and histories and books that talk about, life in the monastery and philosophy and magic and religion and all that. But they probably also have a couple, secrets. I'm reminded of the waterbending scroll from Avatar: The Last Airbender, but not the movie. The movie sucked. I'm imagining that they want, the PCs come to that monastery and they're searching for the secret library because it probably has some maps to some places that hold treasure. I'm pretty sure the monastery itself has some legendary weapons in it, special magic items with a history all of its own. And because that just makes sense, like in Kung Fu Panda when he's traveling through the jade halls and there's the sword and the jar filled with 1,000 souls and all that kind of fun stuff. That's easy to incorporate. But you don't want to have it too early on. If it's in a low level area, that's why I think splitting it up into multiple temples multiple monasteries that all belong to the same basic, temple order. That way you have clues that lead you from one to the next and each one gets increasingly difficult. What other ideas did I have? Because this was the idea I was having when I thought about the spider. I did think about the spider in the forest, but it happened at the same time that I was thinking about Xian Gi Wo. And so now somewhere there has to be spiders in the monastery. There are abandoned monasteries. There are many different versions of the giant spiders, such that you can pick one that has better magical powers in order to challenge the PCs at an appropriate level. I can stick spiders in anywhere I want. I definitely want the mana core. I'm really loving right now the idea of undead kicking your ass with martial arts. Getting, oh, karate kicked by a skeleton and judo thrown by a zombie. That's pretty sweet. They're going in at some point as well. So that's the beginning of Xian Gi Wo. We have a couple ideas that we're getting out, and like I had mentioned a million times before to myself, only a couple times on the videos, you only need the ideas at first. It's only when the PCs decide they're going somewhere that you really need to sit down and plan out exactly what's going to be there. Draw maps, choose monsters, and what have you. The only issue that Xian Gi Wo brings up that I have to think about a little bit more in advance is linking different dungeons together. Where can I, they can find the dead body of a monk with a map back to his monastery in any other dungeon so that that'll lead them to one of the monasteries at first or later on, and each monastery can lead to each next one in other places as well. So that's the current territory I'm exploring, and this guy is badass. I love him. He's so cool. He's gonna stab that Ankeg to death. Bye bye.